Today we read the beginning of chapter 15 in the Gospel of Luke. And it's a really important chapter. And often some of the commentators, if you read it, they call it the Gospel within the Gospel. And that's because in this chapter, what's presented there basically encapsulates or presents very briefly the good news, everything that we need to know as Christians, everything that we need to know as followers. In Luke, the good news is all about God's mercy, divine mercy. And, mercy is something that we talk about and something that we pray for, but I think we do so without fully understanding exactly what mercy is. When a Jew prayed for mercy, what they were doing, they were asking God, be faithful to yourself. Be faithful to who you are. Be faithful to what you've promised. Because their understanding of mercy was just that when God acts with mercy, he's acting according to what he's promised, according to what he is. And so when you call upon God and ask him to be merciful, you're asking him to be faithful to himself, to remember himself, to remember what he's promised, and to fulfill that. And that's why in the apostolic tradition, or our tradition, we so often pray throughout our services, Lord, have mercy. It's an important prayer, and one that we just can't say so lightly and just blow off without even thinking about what we're saying. Because what we're doing is we're asking God to fulfill everything that he's ever promised. That's what we're asking when we're asking to be merciful. And the good news is that he is merciful, that he does remember himself, that he does remember everything that he's promised, and he's ready to give that to us. And this chapter in the Gospel of St. Luke is all about that mercy, all about discovering that mercy, living with it, living in it. And in order to really fully understand what's being said in this 15th chapter of the Gospel of St. Luke, you need to understand a little bit about what happened right before it, at the end of chapter 14. Because there at the end of chapter 14, you see some of the hard sayings of Jesus, some of the things that most of us rarely, if ever, want to deal with, where Jesus talks about taking up his cross and following him, about letting go of anyone or anything that's important to you, about selling everything that you have in order to become his follower. Those are the hard sayings of Jesus. Those are the hard teachings. And he ends chapter 14 right there. And he ends saying that we're salt, but if salt loses its flavor, it's worthless and deserves to be just flung away. We're salt. We're supposed to be the salt of the earth, to give flavor by the witness of our lives to everything around us, and to so help transform life and the world all around us. He calls upon us to be his followers, to be the salt of the earth. But if salt loses its flavor, it's worthless. At that point, chapter 15 begins with the words, "Then the tax collectors and the sinners drew near to him." Then. In other words, they were the only ones. The tax collectors and the sinners, the people who aren't supposed to get it, they are the ones that draw near. They are the ones that get it. They are the ones that hear the message and understand what Christ is talking about. They are the ones willing to risk everything and lose everything in order to be his followers. The weak and the sinful and the poor. They are the ones willing to embrace his teachings. And it's the supposed religious people, the scribes and the Pharisees, who begin grumbling about it, refusing to understand it, refusing to get it. And so these three parables, we read two of them today, but the chapter 15 of Luke is three parables, the third one being the parable of the prodigal son. But these first two parables are addressed to the scribes and to the Pharisees, to the religious leaders supposedly of that day and time, to get them to understand what the poor and the sinful understood, what it means to be his follower, what it means to understand the mercy of God, what it means to understand that God never forgets what he's promised. And so that's what these two parables are about this morning. And the first one, of course, he talks about the lost sheep and how the shepherd is willing to leave his entire flock behind and go after the one lost sheep. I don't know how much you know about sheep. I know a little. I know that they're dumb. Kind of like me. And when they get lost, what they do is they pick a spot and they lie there. And they won't budge because they're lost. Kind of like you and me, huh? You know, we just pick our spot and we just lie there. Stuck in whatever it is that we're doing, stuck in whatever it is that we're thinking, whatever patterns of behavior, we just get stuck there, lost. And when a shepherd would find one of those sheep, pick it up, place it over his shoulders, carry 2 legs here, 2 legs here, carry the sheep back to the flock because the sheep had no idea where to go. And sometimes neither do we. And so he picks us up and carries us and brings us back to the fold, back to where we belong, and everything's good again. Sometimes also the shepherd would take that sheep and break one of its legs, not out of meanness, not out of hatefulness, but out of love and out of mercy and out of hope that the good things. I mean, if you break that leg, the sheep has to hobble and limp and stay close to the shepherd and never get lost again. So is there maybe some pain in your life, maybe some misery that you don't understand, that you never expected? I speak from experience. Maybe your leg has been broken, and maybe it's been broken for a reason. Maybe the shepherd is just saying to you, stay close, and let me carry you, and let me bring you back to where you belong. We can get lost, and we can just pick our spot and lie there, or we can let him carry us and give us what we need in order to really appreciate him and to follow him as he wants us to follow him. That's what God's mercy is all about. That's how he remembers his promises to us. To care for us enough to discipline us when we need it, to bring us back to where we need to be. Then Jesus talks about the poor woman who loses her coin. And you say, what's the big deal? It's just a coin. What's the big deal here? The poor in those days, poor women would wear a kind of a headdress. And on that headdress, they would put 10 coins. 10 coins, drachma, you know. And that was their jewelry. That was her wedding ring. That was everything that she had. Those coins were, to her, incredibly precious. So if you lose one, that's devastating. And so they would sweep. Because the houses were small, very dimly, poorly lit. Usually one little window by the door. So they would sweep with the hope that they would hit the coin with the broom and they would hear it jingle and be able to find it. That's how precious that little coin was. That's how precious each of us is in God's eyes. Because when we get lost, he'll sweep and sweep and sweep until he finds us. He'll stop at nothing until he finds us, because we are his jewelry. We are God's jewelry, and we are precious in his sight. And we mean that much to him that he'll stop everything and do what he has to do in order to find us. That's mercy. That's God remembering what he's promised, being faithful to what he's promised. And that's what we have to stop and realize. The goal of our life as Christians, as his followers, is to let ourselves be found, to let him find us, to let him carry us when we need to be carried, to let him break us when we need to be carried, and to let him sweep us clean whenever we need that. That's how he finds us. That's how he ministers to us. That's how he remains faithful to us, giving us everything that he's ever promised. And when that happens, Jesus says, when someone who's lost is found, there is joy in heaven. Think about that. When you go wrong and you let yourself be found, God rejoices. God's happy over that. God's happy over that. And those of you who've been paying attention to the studies of the book of Revelation know that when something happens in heaven, a corresponding event happens on earth. So if there's joy in heaven, then there has to be joy here on earth as well, to complete the picture, to get us to understand the fullness of what mercy really means. So where is the joy here? The joy that we're supposed to experience. The joy that comes from knowing him and letting him find us. That comes when we look at those hard sayings in chapter 14. When we look at that and decide to take that risk. When we decide, I'll let go of everything that I think is important to me. I'll sell whatever I have. I'll do whatever I have to do to become his follower. I'll accept everything he says, everything he means, everything he teaches, and I will let that form and direct and change my life from this point forward. When we do that, then we know joy as much as God knows joy in heaven. When we commit to that, then we know joy. And the really good thing is that in doing that, we begin to spread that joy. When we become really his followers, when he becomes really the Lord and Master of our lives, I think maybe it makes us a little different. Sure it does. And we can't go back to our old patterns and our old routines any longer. We can't get lost again. Because once you've been found, you've been found. And you can't get lost again. And in that, everyone we meet, everyone that we come across, has the potential to discover God's mercy, has the potential to discover that living this way leads us to something. God is ever faithful to himself. God never forgets what he's promised. He never forgets any of us. We're his jewelry. We're that important. We're that precious to him. So why don't we live like that? Why don't we just commit our lives to being who we are in his eyes? That's what we have to do. To make that decision, to make that commitment, and allow him to find us. And when we do, there's joy in heaven and on earth.